Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. Mist clings to the Hornburg like a shroud of memory, curling through the Valley of Helm's deep as dawn struggles against the darkness. The fortress rises from the stone, ancient and immovable, its walls carved from the living rock of the White Mountains themselves. Banners hang limp in the pre-dawn stillness, their fabric heavy with moisture, waiting for wind that does not yet blow. Below, in the chasm called the Deeping Combe, shadows pool in layers, thick and impenetrable, as if the earth itself harbors secrets it refuses to surrender to the light. This is Helm's Deep as the world knows it, the site of a legendary siege where Theoden King and the last defenders of Rohan held against impossible odds, where Gandalf returned with the dawn and salvation rode down from the heights. Songs have been sung of that battle, tales told and retold until they have achieved the weight of myth, the permanence of legend carved in stone and memory. But before that famous siege, before Saruman's 10,000 marched upon these walls, before the Hornburg became synonymous with last stands and miraculous deliverance, another battle was fought here. A battle the chroniclers forgot to record, the bards neglected to sing, the histories chose not to preserve. It was smaller, perhaps, less decisive in the grand tapestry of Middle-earth's fate, yet no less desperate for those who fought it, no less significant for those who bled and died beneath these same ancient stones. The evidence exists, scattered and fragmentary, hidden in the margins of greater tales. References in the unfinished tales to early conflicts in the Westfold. Cryptic mentions in the appendices of skirmishes and raids that plagued Rohan in the years before the War of the Ring. Tolkien's drafts contain hints, abandoned passages, deleted references, notes scribbled and then crossed out, suggesting conflicts at Helm's Deep that predated the siege that would make it legendary. Why were these earlier battles forgotten? Perhaps because they lacked the dramatic resolution of the later siege, the miraculous intervention that makes for compelling narrative. Perhaps because the defenders who survived had no time to chronicle their deeds before being swept up in the larger currents of war. Or perhaps because Tolkien understood something fundamental about history and memory, that the great events eclipse the small, that legend consumes truth, that what people choose to remember often matters more than what actually occurred. Yet the fortress remembers. Stone holds memory in ways that parchment and song cannot. The walls bear scars from weapons whose wielders have long since turned to dust. The Deeping Wall, that great barrier stretching across the Combe, was built not in anticipation of some future threat, but in response to attacks already endured, already survived. The glittering caves beneath the fortress floor provided refuge not theoretically, but practically, sheltering women and children and wounded warriors from enemies who had come before and would come again. Helm's Deep was not built for a single battle, but refined through many. Each assault taught lessons written in blood and survival. Each defense added layers to the fortress's strategic sophistication. By the time Theoden and his people took shelter there in the desperate hours of the War of the Ring, they inherited not merely walls and towers, but accumulated wisdom, tactical knowledge purchased at terrible cost by those who came before. On this particular dawn, nameless in the chronicles, unmarked in the calendars that measure Middle-earth's long decline, the mist carries more than moisture. There is weight to it, presence, as if the valley itself holds its breath. The guards upon the deeping wall stand motionless at their posts, eyes straining into the murk below, hands resting on spear hafts slick with condensation. They have heard reports, rumors, whispers carried by refugees fleeing eastward from the valleys and farmlands of the Westfold. Orcs have been seen. Not the vast armies that would later descend from Isengard, but raiding parties moving with purpose and coordination unusual for their kind. And with them, men Dunlendings from the hills beyond the western borders, ancient enemies of Rohan bearing ancient grudges that no passage of years seems capable of eroding. The attacks have been systematic, calculated, probing Rohan's defenses and testing its responses, learning the patterns of its patrols and the limits of its reach. Now, as the mist swirls and eddies in the pre-dawn darkness, something moves within it. Not wind, the air remains eerily still, but movement nonetheless, deliberate and stealthy. Shadows within shadows, shapes that might be rocks or might be hunched figures advancing with weapons in hand. The guards tense. Hands tighten on weapons. Breath comes shallow and quick. A horn sounds, not the great horn of Helm that in later years would echo with supernatural dread, but a simpler alarm, a watchman's warning carried on the still air. The note hangs suspended for a moment, impossibly clear, before being swallowed by the mist and the valley's vastness. And in the twilight, the first shadows of war crept unseen beneath the stone walls. To understand this forgotten battle, we must first understand its context within the broader tapestry of Rohan's history. The kingdom of the Horse Lords was not ancient by the measure of elven realms or the kingdoms of Gondor. Scarcely 5 centuries had passed since Eorl the Young led his people south from the distant vales of Anduin, answering the call of Gondor's steward and claiming as reward the green lands that would become the Mark. But those 5 centuries had not been peaceful. The lands Eorl's people claimed were contested territory, bordered by enemies on all sides. To the west, the Dunlendings, displaced by Rohan's arrival, dispossessed of lands they considered their own, nursed grievances that festered across generations. To the north and east, the shadow of Dol Guldur extended its influence, sending forth orcs and wolves and darker things to trouble the borders. And always, from Isengard in the valley of Nan Curunir, there emanated a presence, subtle at first, then increasingly malevolent as the wizard who dwelt there turned from wisdom toward domination. Helm's Deep itself predated Rohan. The fortress had been built by the men of Gondor in the days of their power, when they held all the lands between the Isen and the Anduin, when their watchfulness extended north into the wild lands and west to the Gap of Rohan. They had named it a Glarond, glittering caves, for the extraordinary caverns that lay beneath the mountains, and they had fortified the narrow valley to control access through the White Mountains and protect the strategic approaches to Gondor's northern territories. When Rohan inherited these lands, they inherited also these defenses, ready-made strongholds built by master engineers, positioned at critical junctures, proof against all but the most overwhelming assault. The Hornburg and its attendant fortifications became one of Rohan's 2 great refuges, second only to Edoras itself in strategic importance. Here, the people of the western valleys could flee when raiders came. Here, the scattered cavalry of the Mark could gather and rally. Here, behind walls built to endure, a kingdom could make its stand. The records preserved in Meduseld speak of numerous attacks on the Westfold over the centuries. Most were raids, savage but limited, seeking plunder and blood rather than conquest. Orc bands descending from the mountains. Dunlending warriors crossing the Isen under cover of night. These attacks ebbed and flowed like tides, intensifying in periods of darkness, receding when Rohan's strength waxed and its patrols rode vigilant through the western valleys. But in the years leading up to the War of the Ring, something changed. The attacks grew more coordinated, more purposeful. Where before the Orcs and Dunlendings had operated independently, indeed, had often been enemies to each other, now they began to act in concert, their movements synchronized as if guided by a single strategic mind. Villages that had endured raids for generations suddenly faced organized assaults designed not merely to plunder, but to depopulate, to drive the inhabitants eastward, to empty the westfold of Rohan's people. The refugees who fled to Helm's Deep brought tales of this new coordination, this unprecedented cooperation between ancient enemies. They spoke of Dunlending warriors fighting alongside orcs without the usual chaos and infighting. They described attacks that seemed calculated to isolate strongpoints, cut supply lines, prevent mutual support between scattered settlements. They whispered of a guiding intelligence behind the raids, a strategic purpose that elevated them from mere harassment to something approaching a campaign. Tolkien understood the importance of these preliminaries, these shadow wars that precede great conflicts. In his letters and notes, he frequently emphasized that the battles readers witness represent only the culmination of longer struggles, that the great dramatic confrontations arise from foundations laid in smaller, unchronicled conflicts. The unfinished tales and the appendices contain fragments of this understanding, references to troubles in the Westfold, mentions of Dunlendings stirred to war, cryptic allusions to early assaults upon the Deepingcombe. These fragments, scattered across texts and drafts, sketch the outline of a forgotten campaign. They suggest that Helm's Deep did not face its first serious test during the siege that later made it famous, but years earlier, in a battle that lacked the dramatic resolution, the arrival of Gandalf, the charge of the Rohirrim, that would have fixed it in memory and song. This earlier battle was won, clearly, or the fortress would not have stood to shelter Theoden and his people. But it was won at cost, and the victory was ambiguous enough, hard-fought enough, that it left no clean narrative for the chroniclers to preserve. What the histories forgot, the mountains remembered. The warning came 3 days before the attack, a pattern that would repeat itself in the later, more famous siege, as if the rhythms of assault upon this fortress followed some ancient script written in the stone itself. Scouts rode in at dusk, their horses lathered and blowing, bearing news that chilled the blood despite the summer warmth still clinging to the valley. A substantial force was moving toward Helm's Deep. Not a raiding party, but an army, by the scouts' estimation. Hundreds of warriors, perhaps more, difficult to count precisely because they moved in multiple columns through the broken country west of the Isen. Dunlendings formed the core, grim-faced men in motley armor carrying axes and spears, but mingled among them were orcs, moving in disciplined formations unusual for their kind. And there were reports of other things, wolves larger than natural, and shapes in the twilight that might have been men, but moved with the wrongness of creatures twisted from their proper form. The commander of Helm's Deep in those days was a captain named Grimwold, a veteran of many border conflicts, a man who had earned his position through decades of service rather than nobility of birth. His face was weathered leather, his body scarred from a lifetime of defending Rohan's borders, his eyes the cold gray of winter skies. He received the scouts' report in silence, asked pointed questions about numbers and composition and route of approach, then made his decisions with the swift certainty of long experience. The call went out immediately. The great horn of the fortress, not yet bearing the supernatural dread it would carry in later years, but formidable nonetheless, sounded across the valley, its note rolling through the twilight like thunder. It was a sound every inhabitant of the Westfold knew, had been taught from childhood to recognize and obey. It meant danger. It meant gathering. It meant leave your fields and your homes and come with all speed to the fortress, for war has come to the valley. They came through the night and the following day, farmers driving livestock before them, women carrying children and whatever possessions could be grabbed in haste, old warriors pulling rusted swords from where they hung above hearths, young men barely old enough to hold a spear volunteering to join the defense. They streamed into the deeping coombe in a disorganized flood of humanity and horses and cattle, seeking shelter behind walls that had protected their ancestors, and if the valor were kind, would protect them still. Grimwold watched them come with the grim satisfaction of a commander who knows his fortress will be tested, but believes it will hold. He had provisions stockpiled. Helm's Deep was always provisioned, always maintained as a place of last refuge. He had water from the springs in the glittering caves, an inexhaustible supply that had never failed. He had the deeping wall, 20 feet high and thick enough that siege engines would be required to threaten it. He had the Hornburg itself, that tower of ancient strength rising from the rock. And he had men, not as many as he would have liked, never as many as one would like when facing unknown numbers, but enough, perhaps, if they fought well and luck favored them. The preparations proceeded with practiced efficiency. Livestock were driven into the caves, where they could be sheltered, and their noise would not betray defensive positions. Women and children and those too old to fight were established in the deep caverns, far from any possible assault. Every man and boy capable of drawing a bow or bracing a spear was assigned a position on the walls. Reserves of arrows were distributed. Water barrels were positioned at intervals along the fortifications. The great gates were reinforced with additional timber and checked for weakness. And through it all, Grimwold prowled the defenses like a restless wolf, his experienced eye catching details others might miss. A weak point in the wall's mortar here, an angle where attackers might find cover there. A position where archers could achieve enfilade fire if properly positioned. Each observation led to adjustments, improvements, small changes that might mean nothing or might mean everything when the assault finally came. On the second day, the forward scouts reported the enemy had crossed the Isen in force. They were no longer attempting concealment, but advancing openly, confidently, as if they knew the defense awaited them and were unconcerned. More troubling still, they were moving with coordination and discipline that suggested experienced command. This was not a mob of raiders seeking easy plunder, but an organized force with strategic objectives. As twilight fell on the third day, the enemy came into view. They did not attempt a night assault, unusual for orcs who preferred darkness, but made camp in the approaches to the valley, their fires visible from the Hornburg's heights like a constellation of malice spread across the darkening land. There were more than the scouts had estimated, many more. Looking down at those fires, counting them and estimating the warriors they represented. Even Grimwald felt the cold touch of doubt. The night passed slowly, measured in anxious heartbeats and whispered prayers. Guards stood watch with eyes that burned from refusing to blink, scanning the darkness beyond the fires for any sign of advance. Defenders checked and rechecked their weapons, finding comfort in familiar routine. In the caves below, mothers held children and sang soft songs to keep fear at bay. And in the hours before dawn, when darkness lies thickest and human courage burns lowest, the assault began. Before any arrow flew, the air itself seemed to tremble with impending doom. The first sound was not the expected war cry or clash of weapons, but something more unsettling. A rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if the mountains had awakened and now beat with a pulse of stone and malice. It took the defenders a moment to identify it. Drums. The enemy was advancing to the beat of drums, their rhythm slow and inexorable, designed not for swift assault but for psychological effect, for the gradual building of dread. Then came the war cries. Guttural orc voices mingled with the harsh battle shouts of the Dunlendings, a cacophony of hate and bloodlust that echoed through the valley and seemed to multiply against the walls until it felt as if the very air was screaming. Torches flared in the pre-dawn darkness, revealing the advancing mass of enemies, not a disorganized rush, but ordered ranks moving with disturbing coordination. Grimwald stood upon the deeping wall, his face carved from the same stone as the fortress itself, and gave the command. "Archers, knock! Hold for range! Steady!" The Rohirrim were not primarily archers. They were horse lords, cavalry trained from youth to fight from saddle. But necessity had made them competent with the bow, and desperation would make them deadly. All along the wall, bows creaked as strings were drawn back, arrows knocked and aimed toward the advancing mass below. "Hold!" Grimwald repeated, his voice carrying calm authority that belied the chaos building before them. "Hold until I give the word. Make every arrow count." The enemy advanced, 50 yards, 40, 30. Loose. The air filled with the whisper of feathered death. Arrows arced into the gray pre-dawn light and descended upon the attackers in a lethal rain. Screams erupted from the darkness below, orcs and men alike falling with shafts protruding from flesh. The front ranks of the assault stumbling and breaking as bodies collapsed beneath their feet. But they did not falter. The drums continued their remorseless beat, and the attackers pressed forward, stepping over their fallen companions without hesitation, raising crude shields to ward against the next volley. These were not raiders seeking easy prey, but committed warriors accepting casualties as necessary cost, pressing the assault despite losses that would have broken a less determined force. The second volley flew. The third. Each took its toll, carving gaps in the advancing ranks, leaving behind a trail of the dead and dying that marked their approach like grim signposts. Yet still they came, driven by purpose or command, or perhaps by the simple momentum of mass violence that, once unleashed, becomes difficult to halt. They reached the base of the deeping wall in a crash of bodies and weapons, immediately beginning the grim work of assault. Ladders, crude but functional, were thrown up against the stone. Grappling hooks sailed over the parapet, their barbed heads biting into stone and wood. The attackers began to climb, swarming up the ladders and ropes with the desperate strength of those who know retreat means death from their own commanders, as surely as advancing means death from defenders' weapons. The defenders met them at the wall's crest with spears and swords. stabbing down at hands that gripped the parapet, hacking at ladder rungs, cutting ropes and sending climbers plummeting back to the ground. It was brutal, intimate work, not the clean heroism of cavalry charges, but the savage close-quarters butchery of wall defense, where survival measured itself in inches and seconds, where every moment demanded absolute focus, and every error meant death. One section of wall nearly fell. A cluster of orcs gained the parapet simultaneously, too many to immediately repel, and for a desperate span of heartbeats, it seemed they would establish a foothold from which the entire defense might unravel. But Grimwald was there, his sword red to the hilt, rallying defenders with voice and example, personally leading a counterattack that drove the orcs back over the wall in a tumbling mass of broken bodies. The assault continued through the dawn and into full morning. Wave after wave of attackers surged against the deeping wall, each repelled but each taking toll, each costing arrows and strength and blood. The defenders fought with the stubborn courage of those defending their homes and families, knowing that behind them in the caves sheltered everything they loved, that if they failed here there would be no second chance, no deeper position to which they could retreat. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to the carnage unfolding beneath it. The valley filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel on steel, the screams of wounded, the shouts of commanders attempting to maintain order amid chaos, the incessant drums that never paused, never faltered, that continued their relentless rhythm like the heartbeat of war itself. An attempt was made to fire the great wooden gates. A party of orcs carrying torches and bundles of oil-soaked rags made a desperate rush, attempting to get close enough to set the gates ablaze. Archers cut down most before they reached their target, but a few survived long enough to hurl their burning brands. Flames licked at the ancient wood, beginning to catch and spread, threatening disaster. Defenders poured water from the wall, desperately trying to douse the flames while simultaneously fighting off the continued assault. For long minutes, the outcome hung in balance. If the gates burned through, the defensive position would collapse, the fortress would fall. But the wood was old and thick, treated with substances that resisted fire, and the defenders' water eventually prevailed. The flames guttered and died, leaving the gates blackened but intact. By midday, the first assault had been repelled. The attackers drew back, leaving behind a carpet of their dead before the deeping wall, retreating beyond bow range to regroup and tend their wounded. The drums finally ceased, their sudden silence almost shocking after hours of constant thunder. The defenders slumped against the walls, exhausted beyond measure, drinking water with shaking hands, binding wounds hastily with whatever cloth came to hand. They had held. The first assault had failed, but even in victory, they knew this was only beginning. The enemy had tested the defenses, probed for weaknesses, paid in blood for knowledge they would use in the next assault. And there would be a next assault. The number of enemy fires visible beyond the valley had not decreased. If anything, they had multiplied, suggesting reinforcements had arrived during the battle, more warriors added to replace those who had fallen. Though the clash ended, its echoes carved fear into the hearts of those who survived. In the lull between assaults, as defenders grabbed what rest they could and healers moved among the wounded, the true heroes of this forgotten battle began to emerge. Not the named captains whose deeds might be recorded in official chronicles, but the ordinary soldiers, the unnamed warriors whose individual acts of courage collectively determined survival or annihilation. There was Wulfgar, a farmer from the western valleys who had never held a sword in anger before this day. When the orcs gained the wall in that desperate moment, when it seemed the defense might break, Wulfgar found himself facing 3 attackers simultaneously. He should have died. He had no training, no experience, nothing but desperation and the knowledge that his wife and 3 children sheltered in the caves below. Somehow, through luck or divine grace or the simple bloody-minded refusal to fall, he survived that encounter, killing 2 orcs with wild, graceless swings before the 3rd was cut down by Grimwold's veteran blade. Wulfgar would carry scars from that fight for the rest of his life. A ruined shoulder, a face split by an orc blade. But he survived, and more importantly, the wall held. There was Hild, a woman too stubborn to shelter with the others in the deep caves, who instead positioned herself at the wall with a bow and proved to have an archer's eye that shamed many of the men. She never missed, never wasted an arrow, and in the battle's desperately pressed moments, her steady presence provided an anchor of calm competence that helped steady those around her. She would die 3 days later, an infection from a minor wound, the sort of mundane tragedy that war creates in abundance. But in this battle, her contribution was immeasurable. There was Thengel, not the king of that name, but a young man barely 18, who found himself assigned to defend a section of wall with only 2 companions. When the assault came heaviest at their position, when ladders and grappling hooks came faster than 3 defenders could possibly repel them, Thengel did not retreat or call for help. Instead, he seized a barrel of oil kept for lamps and poured it over the wall onto the climbers below, then dropped a torch into the spreading liquid. The screams that followed would haunt his dreams, but the assault at that section broke, giving defenders desperately needed respite. These stories, and hundreds like them, would never be recorded in the official chronicles, would never be sung by the minstrels of Meduseld. The names of these warriors would fade with their generation, their deeds known only to those who fought beside them and eventually forgotten entirely as time and death claimed the last witnesses. But in the moment, they were everything. They were the difference between holding and breaking, between survival and massacre, between a forgotten victory and a catastrophe that might have changed Rohan's fate. Tolkien understood this profoundly. The way great events are built from innumerable small acts of courage, the way history remembers the commanders and forgets the soldiers, the way legend simplifies and sanitizes what was actually experienced as chaos and terror and desperate improvisation. His letters speak often of the common soldiers he knew during the Great War, men who displayed extraordinary courage in circumstances of unrelenting horror, yet whose names appear on no monuments, whose stories were never told, who were simply present and did what was necessary, and then, if they survived, returned to ordinary lives carrying memories they could never adequately explain. In this first battle for Helm's Deep, such men and women constituted the defense. Yes, Grimwold provided leadership and tactical acumen. Yes, the fortress's ancient strength provided foundation for resistance. But between the stone and the strategy existed the human element, hundreds of individual decisions to stand rather than flee, to fight despite fear, to endure when every instinct screamed for escape. Some of these decisions were quietly heroic. Others were simply the result of having no choice, of being trapped by circumstances that offered only survival through resistance or death through flight. Tolkien never romanticized war. never suggested that courage eliminated fear or that determination guaranteed survival. His battles are chaotic, terrifying affairs where luck matters as much as skill, where survival often depends on factors beyond individual control, where heroes are as likely to die meaninglessly as to triumph gloriously. Yet within that grim realism exists acknowledgement of genuine heroism, not the sanitized version found in propaganda, but the real thing, the decision to act despite fear, to protect others at risk to oneself, to hold position when every reasonable calculation says to run. These unnamed defenders of Helm's Deep displayed such heroism, and though their names faded from memory, their deeds echo still in the stone they defended and the descendants who lived because they stood fast. The healers moved among the wounded, doing what they could with limited supplies and knowledge. Many who survived the battle would not survive the night. Wounds that seemed minor would fester and kill. Internal injuries would slowly drain life. Simple blood loss would prove too great despite all efforts. War's butcher's bill extends beyond those killed in the moment of combat, includes all those who die slowly in its aftermath, victims not of enemy weapons, but of infection and shock and simple physical trauma beyond the body's capacity to heal. In the shadow of legend, the courage of the forgotten burns quietly still. As the defenders rested and regrouped, Grimwald ascended to the highest point of the Hornburg, looking down upon the Deepingcombe with the eyes of a commander who must think not only of the present battle, but of battles to come. The fortress had been designed by masters of military architecture, and understanding that design, how each element supported the whole, how the terrain had been incorporated into the defensive scheme, was essential to effective defense. The Deepingcombe itself was the first line of defense, a narrow valley with steep sides, restricting the number of attackers who could approach the fortress simultaneously. An army might number thousands, but if only hundreds can reach the walls at any given time, numbers lose much of their advantage. The valley funneled attackers into killing zones, forced them to advance through positions where defenders held every advantage of height and prepared position. The Deeping Wall stretched across the valley floor, 20 feet high and wide enough at its crest for defenders to stand two abreast. It was not merely a barrier, but a killing ground. Attackers attempting to scale it exposed themselves to fire from above, from the Hornburg's heights, and from positions along the wall itself. Every yard of approach was covered by multiple fields of fire. Every route of advance had been calculated and countered by builders who understood siege warfare intimately. Behind the wall stood the Hornburg itself, a tower rising from the rock, its lower levels carved from the mountain's bones, its upper reaches built from stones so perfectly fitted that no mortar was needed. This tower served multiple purposes: command post from which the entire valley could be observed, final redoubt if the outer defenses fell, symbol of strength meant to daunt attackers and inspire defenders. Its position was perfect, jutting from the mountain's flank, impossible to surround, commanding approaches from multiple directions. But perhaps most critically, the fortress incorporated the glittering caves, a vast network of caverns extending deep into the White Mountains. These caves provided water from underground springs, shelter for non-combatants, storage for provisions, and if necessary, escape routes through passages known only to those who had explored them across generations. An army might take the walls, might even take the Hornburg, but rooting defenders out of those caves would require resources and time that few besiegers could afford. Grimwold understood all this intellectually. It was his profession, his life's study. But the morning's battle had provided practical education that theory could not. He had seen where the defenses held easily and where they had been pressed nearly to breaking. He had learned which positions gave defenders advantage and which left them vulnerable. He had identified weaknesses in the wall's construction, places where mortar had deteriorated, stones had shifted, foundations had settled unevenly. More importantly, he had learned about his enemy. They were disciplined, accepting casualties that would have broken most attackers. They were coordinated, with command structure that could adapt tactics mid-battle. They possessed numbers sufficient to sustain heavy losses and continue attacking. And critically, they seemed to understand the fortress's layout, suggesting reconnaissance and planning that went beyond typical raiding party capability. This knowledge troubled him more than the morning's casualties. Random raiders could be repelled through basic defense, but an enemy with strategic intelligence, with planning and coordination, with sufficient numbers to employ tactics beyond simple assault, such an enemy represented threat of different magnitude entirely. He watched as parties of orcs and Dunlendings moved beyond bow range, clearly visible from the heights, making no attempt at concealment. They were organizing, establishing camps, preparing siege equipment. He could see ladders being constructed, longer and sturdier than those used in the morning assault. He could see what might be a ram, a massive timber being shaped and reinforced. Most troubling, he could see teams working on structures that looked disturbingly like siege towers, mobile platforms that could be rolled to the wall and would allow attackers to reach the parapet without climbing exposed ladders. The implications were clear. The morning's assault had been a probe, a test of defenses and defender capability. The real attack was still to come, and it would be far more sophisticated than what they had already endured. Grimwold made his decisions with the cold calculation of a commander who knows optimism kills more surely than enemy weapons. He ordered work parties to reinforce the sections of wall that had been most heavily pressed. He repositioned archers to cover approaches where siege equipment might be deployed. He established reserves, small groups of his best fighters positioned to respond quickly to breakthroughs wherever they might occur. He inventoried remaining arrows and distributed them to maximize efficiency, ensuring the best archers received priority allocation. And he sent riders, 2 men on the fastest horses, equipped to slip out through hidden paths in the darkness, tasked with reaching Edoras and bringing word of the assault. If Helm's deep fell, Rohan needed to know. If reinforcements could be sent, they needed to be requested. If this attack represented part of a larger campaign, intelligence needed to be gathered and countermeasures prepared. The riders departed as night fell, disappearing into the darkness and the mountains, carrying messages that might or might not reach their destination, seeking help that might or might not arrive in time. Their departure was witnessed by few and noted by fewer. In the chronicles, if such riders were mentioned at all, they would appear as footnote, minor detail in a larger narrative. But for Grimwold and his defenders, they represented hope, thin and desperate perhaps, but hope nonetheless. As full darkness descended, torches were lit along the walls. The defenders stood to their positions, knowing the night would bring renewed assault, knowing exhaustion and wounds and fear would make this fight harder than the last. Behind them in the caves, families huddled in the darkness, praying to whatever gods might listen, waiting for news of victory or for the sound of fighting to reach the depths where they sheltered. Every hill and wall remembered, every move watched by unseen eyes. The army arrayed against Helm's Deep represented an alliance that should not have existed. A coalition of forces united only by shared hatred of Rohan and guidance from a power that remained hidden, but whose influence pervaded every aspect of the assault. The Dunlendings formed the core, hundreds of warriors from the hills and valleys west of Isengard, men whose ancestors had dwelt in these lands before Rohan's arrival, who considered themselves dispossessed and sought reclamation through blood. They were not sophisticated soldiers by Gondorian standards, lacked the equipment and training of professional armies, but they possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain, possessed courage born of grievance, and possessed numbers sufficient to pose serious threat when properly organized. Their leader in this assault was named Freka, though not the same Freka who would later father Wolf and bring greater troubles upon Rohan. This was an earlier bearer of that name, but one equally filled with resentment and ambition. He was a bull of a man, broad and powerful, who ruled his people through combination of charisma and brutality. He had been promised much by his patron, return of ancestral lands, Rohan driven east beyond the Entwash, dominion over the valleys his people considered rightfully theirs. Whether he believed these promises or simply used them to motivate his warriors hardly mattered. What mattered was that he commanded loyalty and could translate that loyalty into disciplined assault. Alongside the Dunlendings fought orcs, not the vast armies that Saruman would later breed in Isengard's pits, but substantial forces nonetheless, drawn from the mountains and the dark places of Fangorn's borders. These were creatures of Sauron's original breeding, predating the corruption of Saruman, shaped for war and sustained by malice. They fought with the vicious efficiency of beings created for no purpose but violence, knowing no fear because they possessed nothing to lose, expecting no mercy and granting none in return. The orcs were organized into cohorts commanded by larger specimens, what Tolkien called fighting Uruk-hai, in distinction from the lesser breeds, though not yet the perfected warriors Saruman would later produce. These commanders displayed disturbing intelligence, capable of tactical thought beyond simple bloodlust, able to coordinate with the Dunlending forces despite the mutual contempt that normally existed between orcs and men. This coordination was itself the most troubling aspect of the enemy force. Orcs and men do not naturally ally. Their mutual hatred runs deep, rooted in fundamental differences of nature and purpose. For them to fight together required external force, a controlling will powerful enough to override their instinctive hostility and shape them into coherent fighting force. That controlling presence remained concealed, but its influence was everywhere evident. The assault's timing suggested careful intelligence gathering. The tactical approach demonstrated understanding of siege warfare beyond what either Dunlendings or orcs typically possessed. The discipline maintained through heavy casualties indicated command structure with teeth, not merely leaders who could inspire, but commanders who could punish, who maintained order through threat as well as loyalty. Grimwald suspected Isengard's involvement, though he possessed no proof. Saruman in these years had not yet openly declared himself, maintained pretense of alliance with Gondor and Rohan, while secretly building power and nursing ambitions that would eventually bring catastrophe. If the wizard was indeed behind this assault, providing intelligence, offering promises to the Dunlendings, coordinating the orc forces. It represented escalation far more threatening than simple raid or even major attack. It suggested calculated campaign to test Rohan's defenses, probe for weaknesses, perhaps even to gauge whether the kingdom could be broken through sustained pressure. The enemy camp that night was a strange sight. Fires segregated by type, Dunlendings in one area and orcs in another, mingling minimized to reduce friction. But across both camps moved figures that seemed to command authority over both factions. Men, if they were men, robed and hooded, whose presence caused both Dunlendings and orcs to defer. These coordinators or agents or whatever they were represented the hidden hand guiding the assault, and their presence confirmed that this was no opportunistic raid but organized campaign. As night deepened, activity in the enemy camp intensified. The siege equipment was being readied, moved into position under cover of darkness. Ladders by the dozens. A ram, its head sheathed in crude metal, mounted on a wheeled platform that could be pushed to the gates. And towers, two of them, tall wooden structures that would allow attackers to reach the wall's crest without climbing. That would provide firing platforms from which enemy archers could suppress defenders. The drums began again near midnight, not the assault rhythm of the morning, but slower, more deliberate, a sound designed to unnerve and intimidate, to prevent rest, to eat away at defender morale through relentless psychological pressure. They continued through the night, sometimes pausing to let silence become its own threat, then resuming with renewed intensity. The assault came in the dark hours before dawn, when human strength and courage ebbed lowest, when exhaustion from the previous days fighting weighed heaviest, when darkness turned every shadow into potential threat. This time there was no tentative probing, no testing of defenses. This was full commitment, every resource the enemy possessed thrown against the walls in concentrated fury, designed to overwhelm through sheer pressure. The siege towers advanced first, pushed by teams of orcs, while Dunlendings provided covering fire with crude bows and thrown spears. Defenders concentrated fire on the towers, knowing they represented the gravest threat, but arrows that would kill individual attackers merely stuck quivering in the towers, wooden walls, providing insufficient deterrent against their inexorable advance. Behind the towers came waves of attackers with ladders, timing their assault to coincide with the towers reaching the walls, attempting to create too many threats for defenders to effectively counter all simultaneously. And against the gates came the ram, protected by a crude roof against arrows from above, pounding with rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the valley itself. The battle dissolved into desperate chaos, multiple crises erupting simultaneously, each demanding response, each threatening breakthrough. The defenders fought with the courage of those who have no choice, but courage alone could not make good the disparity in numbers and resources. And yet, even in their triumph, shadows whispered of greater horrors yet to come. The moment the siege towers reached the deeping wall marked the crisis point of the entire battle, the instant when accumulated pressures threatened to shatter defenses that had held through long hours of desperate fighting. The first tower's top platform slammed against the wall's parapet with crash of wood on stone, and immediately orcs poured forth, scrambling across the short span separating tower from wall, pouring onto the parapet in a black tide of blades and fury. The defenders at that section were overwhelmed almost instantly, too few to contain the breach, too exhausted to mount effective counterattack. The orcs established a foothold, driving defenders back from the wall's crest, creating space for more attackers to cross from tower to wall. Grimwold saw the disaster unfolding from his command position and reacted with the instinctive speed of long experience. He grabbed the nearest reserve, a handful of veterans, perhaps 15 men total, and led them toward the breach in a desperate charge, knowing that if the orcs were allowed to consolidate their hold on the wall, the defense would collapse entirely. What followed was savage close-quarters combat of the sort that breaks men's minds and haunts their dreams. No room for tactics or sophisticated maneuver, just brutal physical struggle in confined space, every inch of ground contested with blade and fist and teeth. Grimwold fought at the front, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision, each stroke calculated to kill efficiently, to conserve strength while eliminating enemies. Around him, his veterans formed tight formation, fighting as unit rather than individuals, supporting each other's shield arms, covering each other's backs, moving with coordination born of years fighting together. The orcs had numbers and momentum, but the defenders had desperation, and the knowledge that behind them, failure meant massacre of everyone sheltering in the caves. That knowledge transformed ordinary men into heroes, not through grand gestures, but through simple refusal to yield, through continued resistance past the point where most would have broken, through the stubborn, bloody-minded determination that represents humanity's greatest strength when pressed to extremity. Slowly, yard by yard, they drove the orcs back toward the tower. Bodies accumulated underfoot, making footing treacherous, turning the parapet slick with blood. Men slipped and died, stabbed while down, their deaths barely noticed in the larger struggle. Others stepped into their places without hesitation, the line tightening and reforming, refusing to break despite losses. Elsewhere along the wall, the situation was similarly desperate. The second tower had reached the parapet at different position, creating second breach that demanded immediate response. The ram continued its work against the gates, each impact a thunderclap that seemed to reverberate through the defenders' bones. Ladders had reached the wall at multiple points, each requiring defenders to repel climbers while simultaneously supporting the fights at the breaches. It was too much. Simple arithmetic made clear that the defense could not hold all positions simultaneously. Something had to give. Some position would be overwhelmed, and from that breakthrough would flow disaster. But then intervention, unexpected and providential. Thengel, the young man who had earlier used oil to such effect, had an idea born of desperation. He saw the siege towers, saw that they were wooden, saw that they stood close enough to the wall that fire might reach them. Without waiting for approval, without pausing to consider consequences, he grabbed another barrel of lamp oil, hauled it to position above the nearest tower, and poured it over the edge directly onto the tower's wooden structure. The oil splashed across timber and flowed down between boards, creating an instantly flammable coat across the tower's upper sections. Thengel dropped a torch, and the result was instantaneous. Flames erupting with savage intensity, feeding on the oil and catching the tower's dry wood, spreading with terrifying speed. The orcs on the tower and those crossing to the wall suddenly found their route of advance transformed into a death trap. Those on the parapet were cut off from reinforcement. Those on the tower itself faced choice between burning and jumping. The screams began terrible sounds, the voices of creatures in agony, as orcs caught in the flames fell or burned, or leapt desperately from height that killed most who tried it. Grimwold seized the moment, pressing his attack on the isolated orcs who had reached the wall, no longer facing endless reinforcements but finite numbers that could be overwhelmed. The defenders rallied, sensing shift in momentum, pressing forward with renewed strength born of hope. The orcs on the parapet broke, attempting to retreat back across the burning tower, most dying in the attempt, the rest cut down from behind as they fled. At the second tower, defenders replicated Thengel's tactic with similar results. Within minutes, both siege towers were blazing pyres lighting the pre-dawn darkness, their collapse imminent, their value as assault platforms destroyed. But the ram continued its work. The gates were weakening, great cracks had appeared in the ancient wood, and the bar behind them was beginning to splinter. Another few minutes of pounding and they would give way. Grimwold made a desperate decision. He ordered oil carried to the rampart above the gates and poured down upon the ram and its crews. Then fire followed oil, and the scene below the gates transformed into an inferno. The ram burned. Its crews died or fled. The assault on the gates ended. As dawn broke over the valley, the attack faltered. The enemy had committed everything. Their siege equipment destroyed, their assault troops bloodied and demoralized, their coordination shattered by the desperate ferocity of the defense. They drew back again, this time not in good order but in ragged retreat, leaving behind hundreds of dead and wounded, leaving behind their burned equipment and broken weapons. The defenders had held, barely, by the thinnest of margins, but they had held. For every step forward, the valley held its breath, knowing the outcome remained uncertain. In the aftermath of the second assault, as the sun climbed higher and revealed the full scope of carnage below the walls, the survivors began the grim work of treating wounded, extinguishing fires, and attempting to restore some semblance of defensive capability before the next attack. But even as they worked, it became clear that something had shifted. The enemy camp beyond the valley showed signs of disorder, arguments visible even at distance, parties of Dunlendings separating from the main force, orcs fighting among themselves in the way they always did when leadership weakened or goals became unclear. The assault had cost them heavily, perhaps a third of their force dead or 2 wounded to fight, and the survivors were questioning whether continued attacks were worth the cost. Grimwold watched this disintegration with the careful attention of a commander who knows that battles are decided as much by morale and cohesion as by tactics and casualties. His force had held, had demonstrated that Helm's Deep could not be taken by direct assault without overwhelming numbers and resources. That demonstration itself was victory of sorts, teaching lessons that would ripple forward through time and shape future battles at this site. The strategic lessons were numerous and profound. First, the fortress's basic design had proven sound. The deeping wall created a killing ground that multiplied defender capability. The Hornburg provided command and control and final redoubt. The caves offered shelter and supplies. Future defenders would rely on these same features, reinforced by the lessons learned in blood during this forgotten battle. Second, certain tactics had proven particularly effective. The use of fire against siege equipment would be remembered and repeated. The importance of mobile reserves to counter breaches had been demonstrated at cost. Positions without immediate support had nearly been overwhelmed. The value of disciplined fighting in tight formations rather than individual heroics had shown itself repeatedly. Third, The enemy's tactical approach had revealed both strengths and weaknesses. Their coordination between orcs and men, though impressive, had proven fragile. It broke down under pressure and casualties. Their siege equipment, while dangerous, was vulnerable to fire and required protection they struggled to provide. Their willingness to accept casualties, though it allowed sustained pressure, eventually eroded morale when those casualties mounted without corresponding success. Perhaps most importantly, the battle demonstrated the critical role of leadership and individual initiative. Grimwald's steady command had kept the defense coherent through multiple crises. Thengel's improvised use of fire had turned the battle at critical moment. Countless small decisions by defenders at all levels, where to commit reserves, when to counterattack, how to allocate scarce resources, had collectively determined the outcome. These lessons would be remembered by those who survived this battle, passed down through oral tradition and practical experience, eventually becoming part of the tactical knowledge that Theoden's defenders would inherit when they in turn found themselves besieged at Helm's Deep. The famous siege would benefit from this forgotten battle, would rest upon foundations laid here in blood and desperation, though few would ever know the debt they owed to Grimwald and his warriors. By midday, it became clear the enemy was withdrawing. Not immediately. They made camp for the night beyond the valley, tended their wounded, burned their dead in great pyres whose smoke rose dark against the sky. But they were preparing to depart. Whatever goal had motivated this assault, whatever promise had been made by hidden powers, it was no longer sufficient to justify continued attacks against a fortress that had proven far more formidable than anticipated. The next morning, they were gone. Not fled in panic, but withdrawn in something resembling order, moving back toward the Isen and beyond. Scouts followed at careful distance, confirming their departure and ensuring no hidden force waited to ambush relief columns or attack isolated positions. Helm's Deep had held. The first battle was won. At terrible cost, perhaps a fifth of the defenders dead, another fifth too wounded to fight, the fortress's supplies depleted and its defenses damaged, but won nonetheless. The two riders Grimwald had sent to Edoras returned 3 days later with a relief column. 200 mounted warriors under a captain of the king's household, arriving too late for the battle, but in time to help secure the aftermath, to escort refugees back to their holdings, to begin the work of rebuilding what had been destroyed. They brought also recognition from the king, commendation for Grimwald and his defenders, acknowledgement of their service, promises of reward and remembrance. These promises were sincere in the moment, but would fade with time. The battle would be recorded in the archives, mentioned in reports, noted as a successful defense. But it lacked the dramatic elements, the desperate last stand, the miraculous relief, the participation of legendary figures. That would have fixed it in memory and song. Within a generation, it had faded from common memory. Within two, it was forgotten entirely save by scholars who studied military records. By the time Theoden rode to Helm's Deep seeking shelter from Saruman's armies, virtually no one remembered that another battle had been fought there, that the fortress had been tested before and had held, that the tactics they would use had been developed and refined in combat their ancestors had endured and survived. What was learned here would echo in stone and memory, though no chronicler wrote it down. Helm's Deep stands eternal, not merely as a fortress of stone and mortar, though it is certainly that, but as something more profound, more resonant with meaning that transcends its physical reality. It has become a symbol woven into the fabric of Rohan's identity, a touchstone of resistance and survival, a monument not just to defensive architecture, but to the stubborn courage that refuses to yield even when yielding would be reasonable, would be rational, would perhaps even be wise. The fortress has seen many battles. The forgotten first engagement we have recounted, the famous siege during the War of the Ring, and doubtless others lost even deeper in the mists of time. Each battle added layers to its legend. Each defense refined its tactical doctrine. Each victory or near defeat taught lessons that were absorbed and integrated and passed forward to the next generation of defenders. But the legend of Helm's deep rests on more than accumulated tactical wisdom. It rests on something fundamental about human nature, about the capacity to resist impossible odds, about the choice to stand and fight rather than flee or surrender when all calculation suggests that fighting is futile. This quality, stubbornness, courage, defiance, call it what you will, is perhaps humanity's defining trait in Tolkien's moral universe. It is what separates those who shape history from those who are shaped by it, what distinguishes heroes from victims, what makes possible the eucatastrophe, the sudden happy turn, that characterizes his greatest narratives. The Forgotten First battle exemplifies this quality perfectly. Grimwald and his defenders had no certainty of victory, no assurance that help would come, no guarantee that their sacrifice would prove meaningful rather than merely prolonging the inevitable. They fought because the alternative, abandoning the fortress, fleeing eastward, surrendering those sheltering in the caves to whatever mercy orcs and Dunlendings might show, was unthinkable. They fought because their families sheltered behind them, because their duty demanded it, because choosing to fight against impossible odds is sometimes the only choice that preserves what makes us human. Tolkien, who had witnessed industrialized warfare at the Somme, who had seen entire generations fed into the machinery of mechanized death, who had experienced firsthand the horror of modern combat, never romanticized battle. His battle scenes are chaotic, terrifying, marked by random death and meaningless suffering. Yet within that grim realism exists acknowledgement of genuine heroism, of courage that persists despite fear, of duty honored despite cost. The defenders of Helm's Deep in that first forgotten battle were not supermen, not legendary heroes gifted with supernatural prowess. They were ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, minor nobility, women like Hild who refused to be relegated to passivity, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to stand rather than flee. Many died. Many more carried scars, physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. Their victory was neither clean nor complete, but they held, and in holding, they preserved not just their own lives, but the integrity of something larger than themselves. This is the true legacy of Helm's Deep. Not any single battle, however famous or dramatic, but the accumulated weight of all the battles fought there, all the last stands made within those walls, all the times when ordinary people became momentarily extraordinary through the simple act of refusing to yield. The fortress itself becomes secondary to what it represents, a physical manifestation of the principle that some things are worth defending regardless of cost, that courage in desperate circumstances is meaningful even when it fails, that the act of resistance itself carries value beyond mere survival. When Theoden and his people took shelter at Helm's Deep during the War of the Ring, they inherited this legacy, even if they did not consciously know its details. The fortress's reputation preceded it, a place that could be defended, that had been defended, that stood as refuge and strongpoint and symbol of Rohan's endurance. That reputation rested partly on the famous siege that would later fix Helm's Deep in legend, but it rested also on the forgotten battles, the unchronicled defenses, the accumulated experience of generations who had found shelter behind those walls and emerged victorious, or at least surviving. The sunrise over Helm's Deep on the morning after the first battle must have been spectacular. Light streaming across the valley, touching the peaks of the White Mountains, burning away the mist that clung to the Deepingcombe, revealing the Hornburg in all its ancient strength. The defenders who witnessed that sunrise, who had survived the night's terrors and the previous day's desperate fighting, must have felt emotions beyond simple relief, pride, certainly, and bone-deep exhaustion, but also perhaps a sense of connection to something larger than themselves, an awareness that they had participated in something meaningful, that their stand mattered. Their names are forgotten now. The chroniclers did not record them. The minstrels did not sing their deeds. The histories moved on to more dramatic events, more famous heroes, battles with clearer outcomes and simpler narratives. But the fortress remembers. The stone bears their marks, sword scars and fire stains, patches where damaged walls were repaired, modifications made in response to lessons learned through bitter experience. And the lessons themselves persist, passed down through oral tradition and practical training, embedded in the institutional memory of Rohan's military culture. When later defenders positioned their forces, they did so based on understanding developed here. When they employed fire against siege equipment, they repeated tactics discovered through desperate improvisation by Thengel and his contemporaries. When they organized reserves to counter breaches, they built upon doctrine established by Grimwald's desperate reorganizations during crisis. The famous siege of Helm's Deep would be won partly through these accumulated lessons, this inherited wisdom purchased at cost by forgotten defenders fighting forgotten battles. Theoden's victory would rest upon foundations laid by Grimwald, though neither Theoden nor anyone else would remember the debt. This is the nature of history. The dramatic moments eclipse the preparation. The famous battles overshadow the preliminary skirmishes. The legends simplify and compress until only the most striking elements remain. Yet something of the truth persists, encoded not in chronicles or songs, but in the fortress itself, in its design and its reputation, in the confidence with which Rohan's people could say, "Helm's Deep has never fallen," and know that statement rested on more than wishful thinking. It rested on battles like this first forgotten engagement, on defenders like Grimwald and Wulfgar, and Hild and Thengel, on countless small acts of courage that collectively built something worth celebrating, even if the individual components faded from memory. As the sun sets over the valley now, centuries removed from these events, the fortress stands unchanged in its essentials, walls still rising from stone, the Hornburg still jutting from the mountain's flank, the Deepingcombe still funneling any attacker into predetermined killing grounds. The orcs and Dunlendings who assaulted it are dust. The defenders who held it are dust. Even the memory of their battle has largely dissolved into dust, but the fortress stands. And it will continue standing, monument to courage and endurance, and the stubborn refusal to yield that characterizes the best of humanity, until the world's ending and beyond. not because of its famous battles alone, but because of all the battles, chronicled and forgotten, famous and obscure, dramatic and mundane, that tested it and found it sufficient. And so Helm's Deep stands eternal, not only as a fortress of stone, but as a monument to the silent heroism that shaped a kingdom, defended a people, and preserved a legacy whose true dimensions will never be fully known, but whose effects echo still in the enduring strength of walls that have never fallen, in the confidence of a people who know their ancestors held against impossible odds, in the eternal truth that some things are worth defending regardless of cost or recognition or remembrance. The mist returns as darkness falls, curling through the valley as it always has, as it always will, carrying whispers of battles fought and heroes forgotten. Guardian of secrets the stone keeps but the chronicles lost, eternal witness to the truth that courage and sacrifice and stubborn defiance matter even when, perhaps especially when, no one remembers them. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.